All right. So moving on to our last story, I guess you can call it. I just wanted to kind of talk about Kamala's VP pick and, a lot of so-called progressive commentators are talking about him as the best possible choice she could have made, and I suppose in a purely relativistic sense that might be true, but it's kind of like a gut punch and a slap in the face are better than a sharp stick in the eye. Neither are are something I would wish for. Um, so here's just a couple of the things that are surfacing with Tim Walz. The Republicans are trying to go after him for this whole stolen valor thing. I don't know if that's gonna land. I'd really have to see more about it. I'm sure they're digging into it to see if there's really any there. But what I have been seeing from some of the actual principled lefties on YouTube and other outlets is going back through his records on some of the more consequential happenings of the last 4 or 5 years. So, one of those being the massive pandemic and insane government overreach that happened as a result. And so we have here the title in Reason magazine: Tim Walz was a COVID-19 tyrant. The Minnesota governor actually defended the state's disastrous nursing home policies. Let's go through this really quick. Vice President Kamala Harris has chosen Governor Tim Walz. He was a moderate Democrat when he served in the House of Representatives, but veered left during his 2 terms as governor. He referred to socialism as synonymous with neighborliness. Whatever, dude. Pursued an extremely progressive governing agenda. What is that even supposed to mean? Universal free school lunches. That's fine. Aggressive targets on climate change and renewable energy. I mean, we should definitely move towards renewable energy, but it's it really depends on the specifics. It's like, if it's akin to California where they're like, oh, only EV sales, what is it, 2030 on? It's like, yeah, dude, we have rolling brownouts and like power outages, and we have PG&E starting fires all the time. And you want to stress the grid like that? What a great idea. So it really, you got to get into the weeds on that. Speaking of weed, legalized recreational marijuana. That's a good thing. Signed a pair of shield laws protecting people who traveled to Minnesota to receive gender affirming care and abortions from prosecution back home. I mean, the abortion thing, I agree with. Gender affirming care, depends. I mean, if they're consenting adults, aka 18 or above, then sure. Like, I don't even know if the home state would prosecute in that case. If there are, that's ridiculous. It's an adult, they can make whatever decision they make. But for kids, nah, not gonna fly with me. Signed a law ensuring 20 weeks of paid family and medical leave. That's good. See, progressive agendas are good. That's the thing. Again, in terms of the other contenders like Josh Shapiro, the dude who will call you an anti-Semite for literally disagreeing with him at all, yeah, I think this dude is a lot better than that. Prescription Drug Affordability Board. Okay. Yeah, so like definitely not the worst record on, those issues, but here's big ones. Here's where this kind of scares me and starts to rub me the wrong way is a lot of the Democrats turn towards government authoritarianism, and it's crazy how easy it was to do this to people, how it was to scare them into supporting authoritarianism. And COVID was one of the easiest ways to make that happen because people were scared. Oh, you're going to die. You know, if you have a comorbidity, you're as good as dead. So let's look at his record on the pandemic. Walz's coronavirus policies were extremely heavy-handed and restrictive. Under his leadership, the state endured the pandemic in a fundamentally anti-libertarian fashion. When the coronavirus was first spreading, Walz was an enthusiastic promoter of social distancing rules. Now, that's not the, most egregious thing. I think it's dumb because there was never any science behind that. Especially a massively contagious, I don't want to say micronized because that might not be the scientifically correct term, but extremely spreadable respiratory virus. 6 feet. There was never science to back that up. And in fact, there were reports that they initially wanted it to be, what was it? I think it was like 12, 14 feet. But because that would have cut down the amount of people who could be in a business, a lot of business leaders weren't too happy, and so they lowered it to 6. So it was never about the science itself. So, not the most egregious thing, but we'll get to more egregious things. But just kind of a lack of, it was more of I'm for the science and, a lack of critical research into the topic. He described crowds in public outdoor spaces as a little too big. He even defended, here's where it gets ridiculous. He even defended Minnesota's ridiculous hotline for COVID-19 snitches. That's right. Walz's government maintained a method for people to report their neighbors for failing to abide by social distancing rules. Now, if you use that hotline, you are a whole ass bitch. I swear to God, people like you would fit right in the McCarthy era. Wow. Unbelievable. Walz insisted in a recent interview that one-person socialism... Okay, this is... who wrote this? Robbie Suave. Okay, yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Let's tone down the, ridiculous kind of... What is even the word? This doesn't even need to be tied into socialism, dude. When asked by Republicans to take down the hotline, and I'm not a socialist or a communist, by the way. It's like such a weird tie-in that they're trying to do. When asked by Republicans to take down the hotline, Walz responded, "We're not going to take down a phone number that people can call to keep their families safe." What a ridiculous thing to say. So, snitching on your neighbor and complaining that they're not staying within these arbitrary 6 feet social distancing rules is somehow keeping your family safe. I wasn't alive back then. I think a lot of people, was this guy even alive? Born in 1964. No. (1947 and 1959). So this dude wasn't even alive either. Even still, I've learned about and can recognize the parallels to McCarthyism and the whole Red Scare hotline. And this isn't even the Russian boogeyman that they're trotting out, and they've been trotting out for the last 5 years, blaming everything on Russia. This is a virus that they are literally upholding a snitch hotline. That's unbelievable. And though Walz instructed police to merely issue citations to people caught violating stay at home orders, which is still bad enough, he also maintained the right via executive order to issue $1,000 fines and send violators to jail for 90 days. Wow. What's funny is I even got fined for violating COVID pandemic, you know, lockdowns. I went to the beach with an ex at the time, and they locked it down for, I think it was 4th of July weekend, or no, it was some like Memorial Day or something like that, and they didn't want people normally crowding this beach in Carmel, California, Carmel by the sea. And I said, fuck these guys. If I get a ticket, I get a ticket. And big old, bootlicking cop comes over, and I guess, he's just enforcing the law and whatever, orders, I guess you'd say, was going on at the time. But it was just so unbelievably ridiculous. Me and a person who are already, exposed to each other, not being around anyone else, literally on a towel on the beach in the open air, and somehow we were putting other people at risk. It was so unbelievable. And we're like, okay, but we are allowed, as long as we have our masks on, to walk into these tiny little shops. If you know anything about Carmel, it's like a strip of these, I don't want to say just gift shops, but just shops in general that are enclosed spaces. And as long as you're wearing a surgical mask, which I'm sure I'm beating a dead horse by now, but if you are watching this and you're still one of those brainwashed masses who really thought a surgical mask was going to do anything against the coronavirus, let me disabuse you of this absolutely moronic notion. And doctors knew this for the longest time, those are just meant, while you're performing surgery, to keep large droplets and particles that, people frequently, disperse through talking or just breathing, from hitting a person's open cavity while they're being operated on. That's what they are meant. They're obviously, anyone with 2 brain cells to rub together can realize that when you put one of those things on, there's massive holes, because they're not meant to be perfect seals with a really fine mesh that keeps small particulates from going in. Those are meant to stop particles from being expelled out. Now, a respiratory virus isn't just in droplets. At least the COVID-19 pandemic wasn't just big droplets that could spread it. It was aerosolized. And so they literally were doing nothing, but somehow we could walk into an enclosed establishment with a mask that does literally nothing, which objectively had way more risk of us getting exposed to this supposedly, one of the most dangerous viruses ever, than being alone on a beach, literally next to no one. But I digress. This whole thing was just anti-science, as they told you to trust the science, believe in the science, don't question the science, even though that's literally part of the scientific method. It's a massive pet peeve of mine, and hence why this dude is getting on my nerves the more I read about him and his just willingness to completely be authoritarian because everyone else was going along with it, and just no principled spine or curiosity to be like, this doesn't really make sense to me. How is this, just asking obvious questions. So, let's see. If we can get to, oh, here we go. His government maintained that private indoor gatherings should be limited to 10 people because, if it's more than 10 people, there's a ton of risk of getting the virus. But if there's 10 or less, then, somehow that, prevents you from getting COVID-19. Outdoor gatherings were arbitrarily capped at 25 people. Oh, cool, dude. On July 23rd, 2020, Walz declared a statewide mask mandate for most indoor spaces. So this is kind of what I was referring to. If we can get a 90 to 95% compliance, which we've seen the science shows, we can reduce the infection rates dramatically, which slows that spread and breaks that chain. That was never true, especially since, they weren't enforcing, hey, you have to have N95 or like KN95. You could put a fucking cloth mask on and get into places. That's not going to do anything. It is not going to reduce the spread, slow the spread, break the chain, whatever fucking buzzword phrase they were using, that day of the week. This is the way, the cheapest, the most effective way for us to open up our businesses, for us to get our kids back in school, for us to keep our grandparents healthy, and for us to get back that life we all miss so much. For us to get our kids back in school. Kids were literally at effectively zero risk of COVID as long as they didn't have a massive comorbidity. If a kid had cancer, of course they're going to be susceptible to any illness. But the normal child, healthy child, was at basically zero risk from COVID. So the whole get our kids back in school, they should have never left school. That's doing so much more damage than if they were to get a virus and then subsequently get over it and have massive immunity. What followed was the implementation of one of the stupidest COVID-19 rules. Diners at restaurants had to wear masks while walking to their table and moving about the establishment, but were allowed to go maskless as long as they were eating and drinking. Yes, there's the almost tired joke, but it's still good because it's just so obvious and so true that the virus is super respectful. As long as you're eating your meal, it's just going to kind of hang around and not infect you. But the moment that you stop eating and you start to move around, it goes into attack mode. And that's why you got to put your super non-effective mask on. Later in November and December of 2020, Walz issued an extended orders for restaurants, gyms, and other businesses to shut down. This included outdoor dining service for eating establishments. Over 150 businesses formed the Reopen Minnesota Coalition and urged the governor to relent, but Walz was unmoved. These nonsensical policies, the efficacy of which is now doubted by top U.S. health officials, they've been doubted for years by people who weren't just mindless zombies. And now it's finally reaching the top where they're admitting, yeah, that probably didn't help. It probably did way more harm than it did good by crippling businesses. And especially the kids being taken out of schools. The developmental delays are just so infuriating. They were commonplace in blue states. Walz was a vigorous enforcer of them, so yeah, let's just move on to the next thing. He was basically just a COVID-19 tyrant, as Robbie Suave writes in Reason Magazine. Can't stand that. That is not a good look for my view of him. Not that I was going to vote for Kamala and him in the first place, but that's not a good sign when your gut reaction is to go along with draconian authoritarian practices that have no actual backing in science. So we continue. In more support of him having certain semi-progressive policies around the edges, but in his core still being a complete shitlib, Ukraine's U.S. ambassador calls Tim Walz a reliable friend of our country. Basically, he's a Ukraine warrior. He's, consistently demonstrated his support for Ukraine since the Russian invasion began. When I visited Minnesota in December as part of our whistle stop tour for Ukraine with the German Marshall Fund and Howard Buffett, the governor and I met with the Farm Bureau and actually joined him in convincing them of how important Ukraine's victory is to the U.S. national interest. The Minnesota governor has been a staunch supporter of Ukraine since the Russian invasion in February 2022. So, expect if Kamala and Walz win for there to be just an unending commitment to Ukraine, and we're going to spend hundreds of billions more dollars arming them, enriching the military industrial complex, instead of spending that back home, which, not like we're a fucking bustling utopia here. We got roads and bridges crumbling. I live in California. I see homeless people every fucking day. It's not like we could use even a fraction of that back home. No, we have to go fight this proxy war over in Ukraine for a war that we helped to stoke in the first place with our constant threats of NATO expansion with Ukraine and our newfound Russophobia that everyone loves to latch on to. Walz signed an executive order requiring that state agencies terminate existing contracts with Russian entities and refrain from entering into future contracts with Russian entities. Yeah, so he's just a neo-McCarthyite, just, anti-Russia. And look, Putin's not like a fucking saint here, but anyone with two eyes and a brain saw and was warning a decade ago that our constant NATO expansion and threats, essentially what our threats to Russia, was going to spill over and start a conflict. And then between the Maidan coup that Victoria Nuland had a part in and all of this, and Kamala's kind of catalyst, because I'm pretty sure Putin was saying that he was kind of on the fence about invading Ukraine, and then her speech at like a NATO conference is what kind of pushed him over the edge. Don't quote me on that. Let me see. See if this even comes up. Yeah, that's not a good search to actually find what I'm looking for. Here it was, the Munich Security Conference. Harris vowed that the U.S. was committed to Ukraine's sovereignty. So there's a lot of reports that that speech was the catalyst, the straw that broke the camel's back. There were already rumblings that, Russia was going to go in, but that was really the thing that sparked the ultimate decision of Putin to basically be like, oh yeah, you're going to essentially induct the one country that I really, really can't have be inducted into NATO, and then basically implying that you're going to put nuclear capabilities on my border. Yeah, fuck you. We're going in. And so we got, her, who basically helped to spark the war, along with like the NATO expansion and, our constant aggression and stoking tensions by our State Department and the CIA and NATO in general. But then you have her basically putting it over the top. You got this dude who's like a Ukraine warrior, and you got orange unpredictable buffoon on the other side. So I would World War III is on my bingo card. Let's just say that much between the Middle East and then Russia and ratcheting up tensions and the fact that everyone has nuclear capabilities. I'm just not a good time to be a human on the planet Earth. And, we got we got bumbling authoritarian goober guy with complete careerist. I have no actual opinions of my own other than what I'm handed down by whoever's bestowing me with power at this very moment. And then you got, Peter Thiel backed, I don't even know about Vance. Like, just not who I would have picked. Let's just say that as Trump. And then you have, of course, Trump, who's like unpredictable as fuck. Also a political windsock, but less so in a different way than Kamala. She's more of a windsock for whatever, she's handed down on high by the State Department or whoever is, wanting their agenda enacted. And Trump kinda is like that, but then also is more of a windsock for what he thinks his base is going to love. And so we're so screwed either way. Yeah, I just wanted to come on here, get some stories out of the way, talk about how Walz, they're, all these pundits, these supposed independent media pundits are talking about how he's just a progressive warrior, but on two of the most consequential issues of the recent and current day, he's been just completely atrocious. And it's very scary, to say the least, that this is supposedly the best pick that we could have gotten out of Kamala Harris. So thanks for watching. I'll be on hopefully Sunday, maybe Monday. I'm going to be out of town visiting family. So